What happens when a major gun control law suddenly gets struck down in court? In a surprising ruling that's sending shockwaves through the legal and political world, a federal court has just declared a high-profile magazine ban unconstitutional. The decision is already fueling intense debate across the country, and it may soon put even more pressure on the Supreme Court of the United States, also known as SCOTUS, to step in. A federal court has issued a significant ruling declaring that a state law banning certain firearm magazines violates the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. The decision centers on laws that restrict magazines capable of holding more than a specific number of rounds, commonly referred to as large-capacity magazines. These laws have been adopted in several states over the past decade as part of broader efforts to address gun violence and limit the potential harm in mass shooting incidents. Supporters of such bans argue that limiting magazine capacity can slow down attackers by forcing them to reload more frequently, potentially giving victims time to escape or intervene. However, the court concluded that the ban conflicts with constitutional protections for the right to keep and bear arms. The ruling emphasized that firearm magazines are a fundamental component of many commonly owned firearms and are widely possessed by law-abiding citizens across the country. Because millions of these magazines are in legal circulation and are regularly used for lawful purposes, such as self-defense, recreational shooting, and training, the court determined that banning them raises serious constitutional concerns. In its reasoning, the court looked at how modern firearm regulations should be evaluated under current constitutional standards established by the Supreme Court of the United States. The judge noted that the government must demonstrate that any modern gun restriction aligns with the historical traditions of firearm regulation in the United States. According to the ruling, the state failed to provide sufficient historical evidence showing that similar bans existed during the nation's founding era or throughout early American history. As a result, the court concluded that the magazine ban could not survive constitutional scrutiny. This decision immediately triggered strong reactions from both sides of the gun policy debate. Gun rights advocates celebrated the ruling as a victory for constitutional freedoms, while gun control supporters expressed concern that the decision could undermine efforts to regulate certain firearm accessories. The ruling now sets the stage for further legal challenges and potential appeals that may shape future firearm policy across the country. The central issue in the court's decision revolves around how judges interpret the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, which protects the right of Americans to keep and bear arms. In recent years, the legal approach used to evaluate gun laws has changed significantly due to a major ruling from the High Supreme Court of the United States. Some courts now rely heavily on the framework established in Troisny, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, a landmark case decided in 2022 that reshaped how firearm regulations are analyzed. Before this decision, many courts used a two-step balancing test. Judges would first determine whether the law affected Second Amendment rights and then weigh those rights against the government's interest in public safety. However, the Bruin ruling changed that process. The Supreme Court stated that courts should no longer rely on balancing tests. Instead, they must examine whether a modern firearm regulation is consistent with the historical tradition of gun regulation in the United States. Under this historical test, the government must demonstrate that a modern restriction has a comparable historical precedent, especially from the time of the nation's founding in the late 18th century or from the early years of the Republic. If lawmakers cannot show a similar type of restriction existed during those periods, the modern law may fail constitutional review. In the magazine ban case, the judge applied this framework and carefully examined historical records, firearm laws from the founding era, and early regulations related to weapons and ammunition. The court ultimately determined that the government did not present convincing historical examples of laws banning commonly owned firearm magazines or similar equipment. Because the restriction lacked historical support, the judge concluded that it could not be justified under the constitutional standard established by the Supreme Court. This interpretation highlights how the Bruin decision is continuing to influence gun-related cases nationwide. As more courts apply this historical test, many existing firearm regulations are now facing renewed legal scrutiny and challenges across the country. Firearm magazines have become one of the most debated components in the broader discussion about gun laws in the United States. A magazine is the part of a firearm that stores ammunition and feeds it into the chamber when the weapon is fired. Many modern firearms are designed to operate with detachable magazines, and these magazines can vary in size and capacity. The controversy often focuses on magazines that hold more than a certain number of rounds, which lawmakers frequently refer to as large-capacity magazines. These devices have been at the center of numerous legislative efforts aimed at reducing gun violence. Supporters of magazine capacity limits argue that restricting how many rounds a magazine can hold could potentially reduce the severity of mass shooting incidents. Their reasoning is that if a shooter must reload more frequently, it may slow down the pace of an attack and create moments where victims or bystanders can escape or intervene. Because of this belief, several states have enacted laws that limit magazines to capacities such as 10 or 15 rounds. Opponents of these restrictions strongly disagree with that approach. They argue that millions of these magazines are already legally owned by responsible citizens throughout the country and are commonly used for lawful purposes. Many gun owners rely on standard capacity magazines for self-defense, competitive shooting, and recreational use at firing ranges. From this perspective, banning commonly owned equipment places limits on law-abiding citizens rather than addressing criminal behavior. Courts examining these disputes often focus on whether the item being restricted is considered in common use. This concept comes from previous rulings by the Supreme Court of the United States. Interpreting the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. If an accessory or firearm component is widely owned and commonly used for lawful activities, courts may view bans on that item as constitutionally problematic. Because of these competing arguments, magazine regulations have become a focal point in the ongoing legal and political battle over gun rights and firearm regulation across the United States. The recent ruling striking down a magazine ban is part of a much larger trend unfolding across the United States. In the years following the landmark decision in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, courts throughout the country have seen a surge of legal challenges against a wide range of firearm regulations. Gun rights organizations, advocacy groups, and individual plaintiffs have filed lawsuits questioning whether various restrictions are consistent with the protections guaranteed by the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. The Bruin decision dramatically changed how courts evaluate these laws. Rather than weighing public safety concerns against constitutional rights, judges are now required to examine whether modern firearm regulations align with the historical tradition of gun regulation in the United States. This shift has opened the door for many previously upheld laws to be reconsidered under the new standard. As a result, regulations related to magazine capacity limits, firearm licensing systems, assault weapon bans, and restrictions on where firearms may be carried have all become subjects of intense legal scrutiny. Different federal courts have begun reaching different conclusions when applying this new test. Some judges have ruled that certain gun restrictions are consistent with historical traditions and therefore constitutional. Others have concluded that similar laws lack historical precedent and should be struck down. These differing interpretations have created a patchwork of rulings across the country, where the legality of certain firearm regulations may vary depending on the jurisdiction. When lower courts disagree on how constitutional standards should be applied, it often increases the likelihood that the Supreme Court of the United States will eventually step in to resolve the issue. The Supreme Court typically intervenes when conflicting decisions among appellate courts create uncertainty about how federal law or constitutional protections should be interpreted nationwide. Because more gun-related cases are moving through the legal system, legal experts believe the Supreme Court could soon face additional opportunities to clarify how the Second Amendment should be applied in modern firearm policy debates. The court's decision could have significant implications for other states that have enacted similar magazine capacity restrictions. Several states across the country have passed laws limiting the number of rounds a firearm magazine can hold, often setting limits such as 10 or 15 rounds. These measures were introduced as part of broader efforts to address gun violence and reduce the potential impact of mass shootings. States like California, Hawaii, New York, and New Jersey are among the jurisdictions that have implemented these types of restrictions, and their laws have already been the subject of multiple legal challenges in federal courts. Although the recent ruling does not automatically invalidate magazine bans in other states, it could influence how judges analyze similar laws moving forward. Court decisions often serve as persuasive authority, meaning judges in other jurisdictions may consider the reasoning used in previous rulings when evaluating comparable cases. If other courts find the legal arguments convincing, they may adopt similar interpretations of the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution when deciding challenges to magazine limits. Legal analysts say the outcome of these cases may depend heavily on how judges apply the constitutional framework established in Neon's New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin. Under that standard, courts must determine whether modern firearm regulations are consistent with the historical traditions of gun regulation in the United States. If states cannot demonstrate that similar restrictions existed historically, those laws may face significant constitutional obstacles. Because multiple lawsuits involving magazine bans are currently moving through the federal court system, the legal landscape remains uncertain. Some courts may uphold existing restrictions while others may strike them down. If these conflicting rulings continue to develop, the issue could eventually reach the Supreme Court of the United States, which has the authority to issue a final nationwide interpretation. A decision from the Supreme Court could ultimately determine whether magazine capacity limits remain enforceable across the United States or face broader constitutional challenges. Even though the court has ruled that the magazine ban is unconstitutional, the legal fight surrounding the issue is far from finished. In most major constitutional cases, a decision at the lower court level is often only the beginning of a longer legal process. The government officials who supported the law still have the option to challenge the ruling by filing an appeal in a higher court. If an appeal is filed, the case could move to a federal appellate court, where a panel of judges would review the lower court's reasoning and determine whether the decision should be upheld or reversed. During the appeals process, courts sometimes place a temporary pause, known as a stay, on the ruling. This means the law could remain in effect while the higher court considers the case. Because of this possibility, the practical impact of the decision may not be immediate, and the final outcome could take months or even years to resolve through the judicial system. If appellate courts across the country begin issuing different rulings on similar magazine restrictions, it could create a legal conflict between federal circuits. When that happens, the Supreme Court of the United States often becomes the final authority responsible for resolving the disagreement and establishing a uniform interpretation of the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. The Supreme Court receives thousands of petitions each year, but only agrees to hear a small number of cases, typically those that involve significant constitutional questions or major disagreements among lower courts. Legal observers say cases involving firearm regulations are especially likely to attract the court's attention right now, particularly after its landmark ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin. That decision reshaped how courts evaluate gun laws, and many new challenges have emerged as a result. If the Supreme Court ultimately decides to review a case involving magazine capacity bans, the justices could issue a nationwide ruling that determines whether such restrictions are compatible with constitutional protections. Such a decision would carry enormous consequences for firearm policy and legal debates throughout the United States. This ruling marks another major moment in the ongoing national debate over gun rights and gun regulation. But the biggest question remains: will the Supreme Court step in and settle the issue once and for all? As the legal fight continues, the outcome could shape the future of the Second Amendment for years to come. If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more updates as this story develops.